The gunshot echoed across the valley, startling a flock of birds into flight against the crimson sunset that painted the Montana sky. Illy Barton lowered his Winchester rifle, watching as the rabbit he'd been hunting lay still among the prairie grass. It wasn't much, but it would make for a decent dinner better than the hardtack and beans he'd been living on for the past week. The year was 1875, and Illy had long ago resigned himself to the solitary life of a drifter. At 32, Illy had seen more of the western frontier than most men twice his age. The Civil War had left him with little taste for conflict, though the skills he'd honed as a sharpshooter had served him well in the decade since. He gathered up his kill and mounted his chestnut mare, Penny, turning toward the flickering lights of Twin Falls in the distance. The small Montana settlement had sprung up near the junction of two rivers, attracting prospectors, farmers, and those looking to leave their past behind. Illy counted himself among the latter, though he rarely stayed in one place long enough for anyone to ask questions about where he'd come from or what he was running from. As he approached the edge of town, he noticed a wagon overturned on the side of the road. A woman in a dusty blue dress was struggling to right one of the wheels while two large trunks lay scattered nearby. Illy slowed Penny to a stop, watching from a distance. It wasn't his business, and trouble had a way of finding a man who involved himself in others' problems. The woman looked up, her honey blonde hair falling loose from what had once been an elegant updo. Even in the fading light, he could see determination etched across her face. "Are you going to sit there watching, or might you lend a hand?" She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. Illy hesitated. He'd learned long ago that getting involved rarely ended well for him, but something in her direct gaze made him dismount and approach, tying Penny to a nearby sapling. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Wheel caught a rut. The axle seems intact, but I cannot lift it alone." She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt across her skin. "Where's your driver?" "I am the driver," she replied, an edge to her voice. "And I would appreciate assistance rather than interrogation, sir." Illy suppressed a smile. "Yes, madam." He removed his hat and coat, setting them aside before crouching to examine the wagon. "On three, push with me." Working together, they managed to right the wagon. Illy checked the wheel and found it sound enough to make it to town. "Thank you, mister," she said, extending her hand. "Barton, Illy Barton." He took her hand briefly, noticing how small it felt in his calloused palm. "Penelope Jackson, I'm much obliged for your help." "You heading into Twin Falls?" he asked, retrieving his coat. "Yes, I'm to be the new school teacher." She began gathering her belongings, attempting to reload the trunks. "Those look heavy," Illy observed, though he made no move to help further. Penelope smiled wryly. "That they are, Mr. Barton. I don't suppose you'd consider I'll get them," he interrupted, lifting the first trunk with a grunt. "But after this, we're square." "Perfectly square," she agreed, watching as he secured her belongings. The road into Twin Falls was quiet, save for the creak of wagon wheels and the soft clopping of Penny's hooves. Illy rode alongside Penelope's wagon, telling himself it was only to ensure she reached town safely. "Have you been in Twin Falls long?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Passing through," he replied. "A drifter then?" "Something like that." Penelope nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "I've never understood men who wander. There's something to be said for putting down roots." "Roots can bind a man," Illy said quietly. "Sometimes it's better to keep moving." "Running from something, Mr. Barton?" He looked at her sharply, but her expression held no judgment, only curiosity. "Aren't we all in some way?" That earned him a genuine laugh. "Perhaps you're right. I myself am running from the stifling parlors of Boston society." "Twin Falls is about as far from Boston parlors as you can get," Illy observed. That was rather the point. They reached the edge of town, where the main street stretched before them, lined with wooden buildings. A few people milled about despite the encroaching darkness, and lanterns cast warm glows from shop windows. "The schoolhouse should be at the far end of town," Penelope said, peering ahead. "There's supposed to be a small house attached for the teacher." Illy nodded. "I know the place." He guided her through town, aware of curious glances from townsfolk not accustomed to seeing him in the company of a woman, especially one as refined as Penelope Jackson clearly was, despite the dust of travel. The schoolhouse sat on a small hill overlooking the town, a simple clapboard building with a bell tower. Adjacent to it was a modest cottage, dark and uninhabited. "Home, sweet home," Penelope murmured as they pulled up to the cottage. Ellie helped her unload her trunks onto the porch, then stood awkwardly, hat in hand. "You should be all right now. Town's generally peaceful." "Thank you again, Mr. Barton." She fumbled with a key the town council had sent ahead. "I don't suppose you'd consider staying for supper." "It's the least I can offer for your help," Ellie shook his head. "Much obliged, but I should be moving on." Disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked by a polite smile. "Of course. Good evening, then." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Jackson?" "Yes." "Town meetings held every Sunday after church. Folks will expect the new schoolteacher to attend." "I'll keep that in mind," she replied, and for a moment they stood looking at each other in the growing darkness. Ellie broke the silence first. "Good night, Miss Jackson. Good night, Mr. Barton." As he rode toward the small hotel where he occasionally took a room, Ellie told himself it was best this way. He'd be moving on soon enough, and school teachers with honey blonde hair and quick minds weren't for men like him. Ellie had intended to leave Twin Falls the next morning. He'd been in town 3 days already, longer than he usually stayed anywhere. But as he saddled Penny after breakfast, Sheriff Tom Miller approached him outside the livery stable. "Mornin', Barton," the sheriff called. "Headin' out," Ellie nodded. "Time to move on." "Shame to hear it." "Got word of trouble brewing north of here. Cattle rustlers hit the Davidson place yesterday. Could use a man who knows how to handle himself." "Not my fight, Sheriff," Miller shrugged. "Pays $5 a day. Davidson's offering a bonus if they recover the herd." Ellie paused. His funds were running low and winter was approaching. A few days' work might see him through until spring. "How long?" "Week, maybe 2, depends on how far they've driven the cattle." After a moment's consideration, Ellie agreed. "I'll ride out to the Davidson ranch today." "Much obliged." Miller turned to leave, then stopped. "By the way, saw you helping our new schoolmarm yesterday. She settling in all right?" "Wouldn't know," Ellie replied, tightening Penny's saddle straps. The sheriff grinned knowingly. "Pretty woman, educated too. Be good for this town to have someone like her around. Might even civilize some of you lone wolves." Ellie didn't dignify that with a response. The Davidson Ranch lay 10 miles north of Twin Falls, a substantial operation with over 500 head of cattle, or at least there had been before the rustlers struck. Ellie spent the next week tracking the stolen herd with 3 of Davidson's ranch hands and 2 other hired guns. They caught up with the rustlers near the Canadian border, a brutal confrontation that left 2 of the thieves dead and Ellie with a bullet graze along his left arm. They recovered most of the herd, though, and Ellie returned to Twin Falls with a decent sum in his pocket and a nagging pain in his arm that he did his best to ignore. It was Sunday when they rode back into town, and people were streaming out of the small white church as Ellie passed through the main street. He spotted Penelope among them, dressed in a simple green dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. She was speaking animatedly with several women, likely the wives of prominent townsfolk. He didn't intend to stop, but Penny had other ideas, slowing as they passed the church. Penelope looked up, her conversation faltering as she noticed him. After a moment's hesitation, she excused herself and approached. "Mr. Barton," she called, "you're injured." Ellie glanced down at his arm where blood had seeped through his hastily applied bandage. "It's nothing." "It doesn't look like nothing," she frowned. "You should have doctor." "Whitman, look at it. Don't need a doctor for a scratch. Then at least let me help." She glanced back at the church crowd, many of whom were watching with undisguised interest. "I have supplies at the cottage." Ellie knew he should refuse, but his arm was throbbing, and the prospect of Penelope's company was more appealing than he cared to admit. "Lead the way, Miss Jackson." The schoolteacher's cottage was neat but sparsely furnished. A small desk in one corner was covered with paper's lesson plans. Ellie guessed, and a bookshelf held an impressive collection for such a remote location. "Sit," Penelope instructed, pointing to a kitchen chair. "And remove your shirt, please." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Don't look scandalized, Mr. Barton. I've tended wounds before. During the war, I volunteered at a hospital in Boston." He complied, wincing as he removed his shirt to reveal the gash where the bullet had torn through flesh but thankfully hadn't lodged inside. Penelope worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with whiskey that stung like hellfire, then applying a salve that smelled of herbs before bandaging it properly. Her fingers were cool and gentle on his skin, and Ellie found himself watching her face as she concentrated on her task. "There," she said finally, stepping back to examine her work. "Keep it clean and you should heal without complication." "Thank you," he said, reaching for his shirt. "The children have been asking about you," she said unexpectedly. Ellie paused. "The children, my students." "Word travels quickly in small towns, Mr. Barton. They've heard stories about the mysterious drifter who's handy with a gun. Stories aren't always true." "No," she agreed, "but sometimes they contain elements of truth. They say you fought in the war, that you've hunted outlaws, that you prefer the company of your horse to people." "Penny is better conversation than most," he replied dryly. Penelope laughed, the sound warming the small room. "Would you consider visiting the school? The children would be thrilled, and it might help dispel some of the more outlandish tales." "I don't think that's a good idea, because I'm leaving soon." She studied him, her head tilted slightly. "Are you? You said that when we first met, yet here you are." "Taking a job isn't the same as staying," he pointed out. "No, but it's not leaving either." She moved to put away her medical supplies. "The Autumn Harvest Festival is this Saturday. The whole town attends. You should come before you leave." Ellie stood, buttoning his shirt. "Why are you here, Miss Jackson? A woman with your education could teach in any city." "Perhaps I wanted adventure," she replied, turning to face him. "Or perhaps, like you, I'm running from something." "What could a Boston lady possibly need to run from?" A shadow crossed her face. "We all have our ghosts, Mr. Barton." He should have left it at that, thanked her for the bandaging, and gone on his way. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Will you tell me about yours someday?" She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Perhaps, if you're still here to listen." Illy told himself he wouldn't attend the Harvest Festival. He had a new job lined up escorting a gold shipment to Helena and planned to leave Friday morning. But when Sheriff Miller mentioned that a group of rowdy cowboys from a neighboring ranch would be attending, Illy found himself postponing his departure to ensure there wasn't any trouble. The festival transformed the town square into a lively gathering place, with tables laden with food, a small band playing fiddles and banjos, and lanterns strung between buildings. Children darted between adults, faces sticky with candy and laughter. Illy stood at the periphery, nursing a cup of cider and watching. He spotted Penelope across the square, surrounded by her students, who were showing her various crafts and treats. She wore a dress the color of autumn leaves, her hair partially down in a way that made her look younger, less like the proper schoolteacher and more like a woman enjoying a beautiful evening. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, her eyes finding his through the crowd. With a word to the children, she made her way toward him, navigating between dancing couples and chatting groups. "You came," she said, slightly breathless when she reached him. "Seemed rude to refuse the invitation," he replied. "And we wouldn't want anyone thinking Illy Barton lacks manners," she teased. The band struck up a lively tune and couples formed lines for a dance. "Do you dance, Mr. Barton?" Penelope asked. "Not in many years," she held out her hand. "Perhaps it's time to remember how." He hesitated, then set down his cider and took her hand. "I'll likely step on your feet." "I'm tougher than I look," she assured him. They joined the line of dancers, and Illy fumbled through the steps at first, but muscle memory gradually returned. Penelope was patient, guiding him with subtle pressure when he faltered. By the end of the dance, he found himself enjoying the movement, the music, and most of all, the way Penelope's eyes sparkled in the lantern light. They danced twice more before retreating to a quieter corner near the edge of the square. Illy fetched them both glasses of punch, and they watched the festivities in comfortable silence for a while. "I'm surprised the town council approved hiring an unmarried woman as teacher," Illy remarked eventually. "They were desperate," Penelope replied. "The previous teacher left rather abruptly when gold was discovered near Helena, and I came with excellent references. Still, small towns can be judgmental. Oh, they've made it clear that I'm expected to find a husband within a reasonable time frame," she said with a hint of amusement. "Mrs. Perkins has already suggested 3 eligible bachelors, including her own son." Illy felt an unexpected twinge of jealousy. "And are any of them to your liking?" They seem perfectly pleasant, she said diplomatically. But no. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted across the square. Illy recognized the raised voices immediately. The cowboys Sheriff Miller had been concerned about were arguing loudly with some of the local men. "Stay here," he told Penelope, moving toward the disturbance. By the time he reached the group, punches had been thrown. Sheriff Miller was trying to separate the men, but he was outnumbered. Illy waded in, grabbing one particularly aggressive cowboy by the collar and dragging him backward. "That's enough," he said firmly. The cowboy swung around, fist raised, but froze when he saw Illy's face. "You're that gunslinger, Barton. I'm the man telling you to calm down before someone gets hurt." With Miller's help, Illy managed to defuse the situation, sending the cowboys to one side of the square while the townsmen retreated to the other. As the tension dissipated, Illy noticed that Penelope had not stayed where he'd left her, but was instead helping a young man with a bloodied nose. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though the mood had been dampened. As the festival wound down, Illy found himself walking Penelope back to her cottage, the cool night air filled with the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. "Thank you for intervening," she said as they reached her porch. "It could have been much worse." "Just happened to be there," he demurred. Penelope studied him in the moonlight. "You say that about many things, Mr. Barton. Just happened to be there when my wagon overturned, just happened to stay in town when cattle needed recovering, just happened to attend the festival when trouble might arise. What are you suggesting?" "That perhaps you care more than you're willing to admit," he shook his head. "I'm leaving tomorrow. Are you?" she asked quietly. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Illy cleared his throat. "It's late. You should get inside." "Yes," she agreed, but made no move toward her door. "Illy, why do you keep running?" The use of his first name caught him off guard. "It's what I know." "Is it what you want?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer truthfully without revealing more than he was ready to. Penelope sighed. "If you do leave tomorrow, I wish you safe travels." She stepped closer, rising on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Mr. Barton." He stood on her porch long after the door closed behind her, wrestling with emotions he'd kept buried for years. Eventually, he turned and walked away, telling himself it was for the best. Illy didn't leave Twin Falls the next day, or the day after. He told himself it was because the gold shipment had been delayed, but in truth, he couldn't bring himself to ride away. Instead, he took odd jobs around town mending the livery stable roof, helping the blacksmith with a difficult horse, even building shelves for the general store. Each day, he caught glimpses of Penelope walking to the schoolhouse with her lesson books, chatting with shopkeepers, reading beneath a tree during her lunch break. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and she would offer a small smile that he couldn't help but return. A week after the Harvest Festival, Illy was chopping firewood behind the hotel when he heard rapid footsteps approaching. He turned to see Jimmy Peters, a freckle-faced boy of about 12 who was one of Penelope's students. "Mr. Barton," the boy gasped. "Come quick, men took Miss Jackson." Illy dropped the axe. "What men when?" 3 of them on horseback, came right into the schoolhouse during lessons, said something about her pa owing money, took her out the back way. Cold fury settled in Illy's chest. "Where's the sheriff?" "Rode out to the Simmons place this morning." "Won't be back till sundown." "Get inside and stay there," Illy ordered. "Tell Mr. Hayes what happened." He didn't wait for a response, running to the livery where Penny was stabled. As he saddled her, his mind raced. Debt collectors wouldn't take a woman by force in broad daylight. This was something else. The kiss of leather against metal was familiar as Illy checked his revolver before mounting. Jimmy had said they'd gone out the back of the schoolhouse, which meant they'd likely headed east toward the mountains. Illy pushed Penny hard, following the fresh tracks of 3 horses that led away from town. After an hour's ride, he spotted them in a clearing ahead, 3 men and Penelope, who was seated on the ground, her hands bound before her. They hadn't bothered to make camp, suggesting they were waiting for something or someone. Illy dismounted and approached on foot, keeping to the cover of trees. As he drew closer, he could hear their conversation. "Your father should have paid what he owed," one man was saying. "Now he'll have to pay double." "My father died 2 months ago," Penelope replied, her voice steady despite her circumstances, "as I've told you repeatedly." "Convenient story," another man sneered. But Mr. Blackstone doesn't believe in coincidences. Rich Boston banker suddenly dies, daughter disappears with family assets. I have no family assets, she insisted. My father lost everything in bad investments. That's why I took this teaching position. Save it for Blackstone, the third man said. He'll be here by sundown. Illy had heard enough. These weren't debt collectors, they were hired thugs working for someone named Blackstone who believed Penelope had something that belonged to him. Whether the claim was legitimate didn't matter. What mattered was that Penelope was in danger. He circled the clearing, positioning himself where he'd have the best advantage. 3 against 1 weren't favorable odds, but surprise would help even things. Illy drew his revolver, took a deep breath, and stepped into view. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said calmly. "Seems you've got something that doesn't belong to you." The men reacted instantly, reaching for their weapons. Illy fired first, hitting one in the shoulder. The man dropped with a cry of pain as his companions drew their guns. Illy dove for cover as bullets splintered the tree beside him. "Barton," Penelope shouted. "Behind you," he spun just as the wounded man lunged at him from the side, tackling him to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, the man's blood smearing across Illy's shirt as they fought for control of Illy's revolver. With a sharp twist, Illy broke free and brought the butt of his gun down on the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. Gunfire erupted again, and Illy felt a sharp burn across his ribs as a bullet grazed him. He fired back, striking one attacker in the chest. The man crumpled without a sound. The last kidnapper grabbed Penelope, hauling her up as a shield, his gun pressed to her head. "Drop the weapon or she dies." Illy froze, his revolver still raised. "Let her go." "Not happening. Put the gun down or I'll paint the trees with her brains." Penelope's eyes met Illy's over the man's arm, which was wrapped around her throat. Despite her precarious position, she looked more angry than frightened. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Understanding flashed between them. Illy lowered his gun slightly, as if complying, then abruptly dropped to one knee as Penelope drove her elbow hard into her captor's stomach. The man's grip loosened just enough for her to duck down, giving Illy a clear shot. He fired once, and the kidnapper fell backward, dead before he hit the ground. For a moment, the clearing was silent except for their heavy breathing. Then Illy was beside Penelope, cutting the ropes from her wrists with his knife. "Are you hurt?" he asked, searching her face. She shook her head. "No, you're bleeding, though." He glanced down at his side. "Just a graze, like the arm." "You're making this a habit," she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Illy stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Who's Blackstone?" Penelope's expression hardened. "Harrison Blackstone. My father's former business partner. He believed my father embezzled money from their firm, but it was Blackstone himself who was stealing. When my father discovered the theft, Blackstone arranged an accident on a construction site they were developing. You can prove this. I have documents my father's records showing the discrepancies, letters from clients. I brought them with me, intending to send them to the authorities once I was settled. Blackstone must have discovered I had them." Illy surveyed the clearing. "The one I knocked out is still breathing. We'll take him back to Twin Falls, let the sheriff deal with him. As for Blackstone, he'll send more men," Penelope said quietly. "Let him." Illy's voice was hard. "This time we'll be ready." The ride back to Twin Falls was tense, with the surviving kidnapper tied to his horse and Penelope riding double with Illy. When they reached town, a crowd quickly gathered as they made their way to the sheriff's office. By luck, Miller had returned early and took charge of the prisoner while Dr. Whitman tended to Illy's wound. That night, Illy stood guard outside Penelope's cottage, watching for any sign of Blackstone or his men. She tried to convince him to rest, but he'd refused to leave her unprotected. Around midnight, she brought him coffee on the porch. "You should sleep," he told her. "So should you," she countered, settling beside him on the porch step. "But I suspect neither of us will." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the small town washing over them. "Why did you come after me?" Penelope asked eventually. Illy looked at her, really looked at her, the strength in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the gentleness in her hands that had twice now tended his wounds. "Because I couldn't not come. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She nodded slowly. "When this is over. When Blackstone is dealt with, will you leave?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. "I don't know," Illy admitted. I've been moving so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay. Perhaps you need a reason, she suggested softly. He reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. Perhaps I'm finding one. Blackstone arrived 2 days later, not with hired guns but with the law, a U.S. Marshal who had been convinced of Penelope's guilt. But Sheriff Miller stood his ground, producing the sworn statement of the captured kidnapper and insisting on examining the evidence before allowing Penelope to be taken. Ellie stood beside Penelope in Miller's office as she presented her father's documents. The marshal, a hard-faced man named Greaves, reviewed them carefully while Blackstone fumed. "This is preposterous," Blackstone sputtered. "These could be forgeries." "The signatures can be verified against company records," Penelope stated calmly. "And the banking transactions are documented by 3 separate institutions." Marshal Greaves looked up from the papers. "These appear legitimate, Mr. Blackstone. Serious allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and possibly murder. This is outrageous." Blackstone reached into his coat, pulling out a small Derringer pistol. "I won't be ruined by a schoolteacher and her gunslinger," he aimed at Penelope, but Ellie was faster, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. Blackstone staggered backward, his own shot going wide, then collapsed to the floor. "Jesus, Barton," the sheriff muttered, but made no move to arrest him. The marshal knelt beside Blackstone's body, checking for a pulse. "Dead," he confirmed, standing. "Clear case of self-defense from where I'm standing. Man drew first in front of 3 witnesses. The documents." Penelope asked, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I'll take them to Boston," Greaves said. "Blackstone's associates will face justice. You might need to testify eventually, but not for some months." After the marshal and Sheriff Miller left to arrange for Blackstone's body, Ellie and Penelope remained in the office, the enormity of what had happened settling over them. "It's over," she said finally. "After all this time, it's finally over." Ellie holstered his revolver. "What will you do now?" "Continue teaching if the town will still have me after all this chaos." She looked up at him. "And you, will you continue drifting?" He took a step toward her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about needing a reason to stay. And I think Twin Falls might need someone to help the sheriff keep the peace. Town's growing, could use a deputy." Hope brightened her face. "Is that the only reason?" Ellie took her hands in his. "No, Penelope, it's not." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing certainty as she wrapped her arms around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know much about staying," he admitted, "but I'd like to learn with you." In the weeks that followed, Twin Falls buzzed with the scandal of Blackstone's death and Penelope's vindication. Far from turning against their schoolteacher, the town embraced her, impressed by her courage and intelligence. Ellie accepted Sheriff Miller's offer of a deputy position, moving from the hotel to a small cabin on the edge of town. By Christmas, it was common knowledge that Deputy Barton was courting Miss Jackson. They married the following spring, a simple ceremony in the church where they danced at the Harvest Festival. Ellie built an addition onto the teacher's cottage, and for their first anniversary, he surprised Penelope with a proper library filled with books he'd ordered from as far away as New York and San Francisco. Twin Falls grew, and with it, the Barton family. Their first child, a son named Thomas, arrived a year after their wedding, followed by a daughter, Eleanor, 2 years later. Penelope continued teaching until Eleanor was born, then focused on raising their children and establishing the town's first proper library. Ellie never returned to his drifting ways, though occasionally he would ride out with Sheriff Miller to track down trouble before it reached town. Each time, he returned home more certain than ever that he had found where he belonged. 10 years after Ellie had stopped to help a woman with an overturned wagon, the Bartons stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard with the family dog. "Do you ever miss it?" Penelope asked. "The freedom of the open road." Ellie wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Not once. Turns out you were right all along." "About what?" "Roots don't bind a man," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They ground him, make him stronger." Penelope smiled up at him. Who would have thought that a drifter who didn't want trouble would find happiness by running straight toward it? "Best decision I ever made," Ellie replied. his eyes reflecting the contentment of a man who had finally stopped running and found his way home.